like as much as you could have a FKR rule set, I think that misses the point, because the point is the world you're playing. The point is that the genre, the tropes you've agreed on, plus trusting the guy or the gal who's just rolling or not rolling, doing whatever they're doing to say, yeah, that's what happens. Those are the two prongs. Trust the referee and each other, and lean into the world. And I think you can really do just about anything you want with that.
Hi, welcome to the Dieku podcast. I'm Gary Snow, and with me is Jim Parkin, the designer of Weird North and Any Planet is Earth. And today we're going to talk about those products and FKR, Free Kriegsspiel Revolution. And first of all, though, we want to talk about Jim and his journey to us today and how he got started in role-playing games. So Jim, welcome.
Good morning, Gary. Good to be here.
So as I talked about, like, how did you get into role-playing games in the first place? How did you decide that you wanted to pursue this as a hobby?
So I grew up in a board game family. We always had a huge shelf of board games, and my brother's significantly older than I am, and so we inherited a lot of the curious older, like Hex and Counter war games that he played a lot. And it's funny, Gary, because we grew up playing constantly all sorts of stuff. We were, like a new thing comes out in Germany, and eventually it would be on my shelf or my cousin's top of his piano. But we always looked at people who played role-playing games and thought, those are the weird people. We don't do that. That's the real nerd thing. Which is funny because, especially as I've come into it in the last decade or so, I don't really understand any of the stigma that come with it. There was no like satanic panic or anything in my family. I don't think that was even a question. It's more of just, we didn't do it. Maybe we were just satisfied with what we were already doing. I recall when I was probably 8 or 9, I want to say that my friend got me to play West End Games Star Wars D6. I don't think I realized that I was doing that at the time. I was just kind of afterwards, I thought, well, we had a fun time with that, whatever it was, and we rolled some dice. Was that a role-playing game? I didn't know. I had no context for it. Looking back now, after running and playing a lot of West End Games D6, it certainly was, but it probably wasn't until 2015, 2016, we had kind of like a every other few months board game get together with my friends and their friends from college. And one of the weeks, one of the guys, Jason, just said, hey, do you want to try D&D next time? I'm like, yeah, why not? I had kind of grown out of being weirded out by that and realized it's popular and it's interesting. And so we played a very simple intro module. I think it was probably like an Adventurers League thing for 5th edition. Tight, enclosed, kind of railroaded experience, but I got to like wrestle a guy to the ground and then kick him down a staircase. And I thought that was a fun night. Also, one of my favorite details, Gary, is that Jason, who was the GM for the night, had a DM screen, but it was just like 4 CD jewel cases that were taped together with like stock art slid into them. And I thought that's so cute and delightful, and immediately disarmed everybody who was like, what are we doing here? It's just like, kind of rolled into it. Nobody was taking it too seriously. And that was a lot of fun. So I think from there, I played 5th edition. I played more of like the modern Fantasy Flight Star Wars, which is a lot of fun and has those funky dice before they became a little more streamlined. And did that for a few years. I think from there were probably a few points we could chart of like how I found different flavors. But that was my intro for sure. It's probably 2 years of that.
And were you the GM at that time, or were you just one of the players, or where did that progression go?
Yeah, for the most part, I was just a player. I recall, so same guy, Jason, was active on RPGgeek.com, and there was a very active play-by forum community there. There still is. And he had said, hey, if you want to do this again, I know we don't meet up all the time. Do you want to try this by post and just have a game there? So I got connected to a table there. And then because of how it's asynchronous and not really a big time commitment, it's like I got a part of like 3 or 4 tables. And then was doing it, kind of check in once or twice a day, throw a post down on a few tables, and like, oh, this is interesting. A little more time to think about it. It was probably about a year into that he said, "Would you ever think of running a game?" And I remember it was the now kind of fabled Lost Mine of Phandelver, the classic 5e starter adventure, which, to be fair, especially looking at it again with different glasses on years later, that was a lot of fun and had a lot of good levers to pull, especially if you don't actually run it as it's meant to be, make it a little more of a sandbox. But I ran that table for like a year and a half. Obviously time is very stretched out for that medium, so that's how it happened. But then I really enjoyed it, and I very quickly realized I like that way more than being a player. I was vastly more interested in all the NPCs and, what does this faction think about this faction? What would be the realistic reaction that they'd have to the players doing X, Y, or Z? And very quickly realized that I was becoming a player less often and being like, hey, if anybody wants to do this module, I'll run it for you. Again, kind of in that slower pace format, but that also gave me a lot of confidence in just trying it, and also trying a different game and seeing a lot of other different play-by-forum stuff that was going on. I'm like, I don't know what a story game is. Let's try one of those. I don't know what Apocalypse World is. Let's try that. That sounds fun. And had kind of like a low risk, low stakes, dip my fingers into a bunch of different bowls of water, So that quickly showed me different types of games, and also like, wow, you can do a lot of different things with this. It's probably around the time, like maybe 2017, 2018, that it dawned on me that there are a lot of competing ideologies or theories or philosophies of play. And I was fascinated by how much people got flustered about, when their game is not necessarily as good as somebody else's game, and why do I even care that they have those opinions? But that helped me to like do more of a deep dive into blog posts for the first time. And then I was just kind of like, the lid came off, and all of a sudden there was just so many interesting things to look at, different styles of play to consider. And I just started weaving things together and seeing what was fun.
And then, so you went down the rabbit hole, and I'm assuming when you start talking about the different philosophies on gameplay, and it wasn't long before you found OSR, which was probably up and coming, if not already kind of fairly established at that time.
And a big part of that, Gary, I didn't know what I wanted. And I think even when I found things that I now like very much, I still wasn't sure if that's exactly what fit for me. I know it's kind of the typical trope of like, play mainstream things, you stumble on a thing, oh, you didn't even know this existed, and then all of a sudden you're in. I don't know if it was quite so like hook, line, and sinker for me there, but I recall after playing 5th edition, and especially in like the Adventurers League context, which is as formulaic as it gets. Now, we did a lot of things that were more homebrew, sandboxy things, like, your actions actually have consequences that aren't a box of text on the next page. But it just kept dawning on me. I remember distinctly that the time where I was like, I think I'm dissatisfied with what I had started with was I've always had like a pet love for Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and wanted to emulate him in fiction and be, just like this, the ultimate heel, just insulting everybody until they're smashed into dust. And it's just multiple times where I'm like, all right, I'm going to pick this guy up and throw him with the other guy. It's like, okay, well, that's improvised unarmed damage. That's D4 die. And I'm like, does the guy fall over? I threw a guy at him. And they're like, no, he doesn't, because that's not how that like grappling rule works. And I just thought, there has got to be a better way to do this. Like, can anybody just kind of let it rip? And I don't want to disparage anybody whose very rules is written, because that's a lot of fun for a ton of people. But I just got me thinking, I'm like, I used to play cops and robbers as a kid all the time, or insert imaginative play. And it's not like, you always hear that as this cop out of like, well, they, everyone's just going to argue about their right until everyone just gives up. I'm like, I don't know, doesn't everybody have such a bankrupt childhood? Like we got along as kids and actually had like, okay, there's stakes to this, Yeah. You can have legitimate consequences even as 7-year-olds and understand that like, there's causation. So I remember I had first seen and I'm not sure if it was on a blog post or something, but it was one of Dyson Logos maps, his awesome cartography. And so I went back to RPG Geek because I'm like, he's probably on here somewhere. I've never heard of him there, but I looked up, sure enough, he had like a little account and it wasn't very active. He's doing stuff elsewhere, but his little profile tag was like, I usually like to play BX Dungeons and Dragons and Labyrinth Lord. And I'm like, I don't know what any of those words mean. And I think part of it too, Gary, was thinking just not having a history personally. I'm like, oh, everybody plays modern D&D. So why, like, nobody plays anything older? Because why would you? There's a new thing. That's the thing you do, which is maybe just a poor conception of it. But so I looked up Labyrinth Lord and thought, well, that looks really cool. And I could kind of tell there's different assumptions at play here. From there, I remember seeing Matt Finch's primer on Old School Gaming, I think it's called, like that Lulu print that he has, and then the Principia Apocrypha, and read through those, and it just realized, like, not, oh, wow, this is so different, but wow, there are different ways to consider this. Like I wasn't convinced, like, screw this, I'm out, I'm doing something different, but wrapping my mind around different ways of problem solving. And I realized at that point that that's actually what I liked about these games, problem solving. And I wanted to find something that treated a situation fairly and realistically. I mean, obviously, there's no such thing as, elf games in real life. Fair enough. That's, anyone making that argument is like such a straw man. The point is, when I'm saying realistic, like, if we establish the stakes of what the world looks like, of what, magic looks like, of, do you have superhuman strength? Are you just a dirt farmer? What is it? Then we should be able to trust each other. And I was thinking about this even back in like 2018. We should be able to trust each other to just let it ride, back to, like, I wanted The Rock to pick this guy up because he's big and strong, chuck him at another guy and see them both fall over. And it's like, that should be an advantageous situation for us now, right? If I was running that situation myself, it'd be like, absolutely, you bowl that guy over, he falls on the table and they're flipped on their bellies for, a good 20 seconds as they're winded. What do you do next? Instead of, how do we apply like rigid codification? That is an unacceptable scenario. So I think it was at that point that I had gotten into more like Powered by the Apocalypse stuff, and was pretty much immediately turned off by the, I think, very false claims that genre tends to make about itself. Again, I'm not going to yuck anybody's yum, but everything there is about, letting the fiction come out first and being, let the situation rise through this resolution that allows some narrative input, and like, narrative input's fun, that's great. But it was, ironically, I think the most rigid system I'd ever seen, because they're like, there's one way to do this. Otherwise, you're betraying the genre you're trying to emulate. And I'm like, I don't have time for that. I still have a lot of those books and I love them because they've got amazing flavor. That's one thing all those games do in spades. But I rarely return to that concept or that approach. I don't think it does what it says it does.
Yeah, and I've heard that story from multiple people through my interviews of, some people just really enjoy it, and if you want that genre experience, it's definitely going to deliver it. But as far as the randomness of life, you're kind of missing out on that, because it's not railroading by any stretch, and there's a lot of input as to what can happen. But the conclusion that I've heard from multiple people now is that the OSR, which is, rulings not rules, allows you to just go almost anywhere. And and I know that a lot of people kind of appreciate that. And so one of the iconic games that has come out of the OSR movement is Into the Odd. And I know that you're a big fan of it and it's inspired you. Can you walk me through the first time you discovered that?
Yes. So I think that was like late 2018. I was looking up kind of, what are other ways that people not hack apart or homebrew 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, but like, has anybody come up with an interesting different system for just feeling out how combat works. Can we take the hour combat and make it like 10 minutes? Can we just speed it up a little bit? Because I love the game, love the community, and a lot of the products are cool. I love the worlds that have come out of it, even if they end up being a little repeat after a while. But I think that was where I found Chris McDowell's blog, Bastionland, he was talking about like speeding up D&D combat. I mean, I think it was basically like the exact, I just typed in a search engine, accidentally the title of a blog post of his, and found it. And then, there's like, this is what I was thinking of in Into the Odd, link. I'm like, well, I'm gonna click that link, saw Into the Odd. And because again, like I looked at Labyrinth Lord and I went back and looked at basic expert D&D, and they were very cool. And I liked them, and I played a lot, and I've run a lot. Even before Old School Essentials was really a thing. But it was still like, there's still too much junk getting in the way of what I think this should look like. And I hadn't really looked into OD&D very much. Like I didn't really even know what chainmail was at that point in terms of the origins, the hobby, what have you. So when I saw that Into the Odd was originally like into the ODD, like it was Chris's OD&D hack. But then I mean, it's just the way he phrased it. He's like, you know what, this is a lot of fun. I'm just going to get rid of the things that aren't fun until only the things that are left. And it also makes sense because we're trusting each other to, like lean into the fiction. And again, I was like, I've tried to see that before and seen people say that they were doing that, but they're not really doing that. And Into the Odd was so cheap. It was like $6. I got it right away and went through it. I was charmed by how much it really did address the things that I was thinking about without doing it 150 pages later. Chris is desperately concise in a way that I admire. You're never going to find a fourth bullet point. There are only ever going to be 3. So I looked at that, and then that was around the time I had found Discord, I think. Might have been a little later than that. But I remember finding myself onto the Bastionland Discord channel. That was really my first interaction with caring much about that platform. And I mean, Gary, as a sidebar, I'm not a very cool person. I'm not hooked up. I've got no social media. I couldn't care less about any of those platforms. I like living in my quiet box with my children and my wife. I don't really go on the internet to, emote. So I didn't know of any other things like this. I was used to like RPG Geek, which is still a quaint, like 23-year-old HTML website, massive RPG database. I like it because it's old fashioned. So Discord was like, oh, okay, this seems very high pace, but that's where people were talking about this. I had totally missed the G+ window. I didn't know that existed. I was late. And just saw like, wow, there's a lot of vibrancy here. And then it was like the concept of hacking your game. I had never heard of that either, even a few years into it. And seeing like, you don't need to do really that much to tweak it to just better accommodate this style. Or I don't like this rule, so I'm just going to take it out. Or I like this added on top. And, this is all very new to me. And Into the Odd was then especially formative for understanding, like, how much can you shave away and still retain the chassis without it being like a punk statement, like, look at how raw this is. Like, no, it's just trying to get the bare bones you need to do what you want to do. And, again, return the emphasis onto the players engaging with whatever story you're telling like it's real. And the like it's real bit is what always came through reading through Chris's blog and seeing, like, I want things to have realistic stakes, and do so without having to abstract a lot of things to make it possible. So that was very formative, to be sure. And I played it a lot. I ran it a lot. And it got me thinking of what are other people who are interested in this game? I wonder what they're doing. And so that's where I, again, kind of returned to the blogs, thought more about like, is anybody talking about this? Are they, adding new starting packages? Are they thinking about, like, what if you change the die, or here's a list of arcana? And it, that really broadened my horizon further to just, the very DIY nature that is often praised about this general niche. That's like, if you don't see something you like, just do it yourself. It's not hard. It's not going to take you a month of publication. Like, you get 800 words in a blog, your idea is there, done, moving on.
And so I know there's the Eclectic Bastion Jam, which was held. I think Yohai Gal convinced Chris to run that, and Weird North was one of the entries that you produced. And when you saw the jam being announced, was that an immediate, like, I'm doing this?
Yeah, so at that point, I had been blogging myself, and I think that started because I had then, like, Chris was still the moderator for the OSR Discord, so I went over there and then saw, like the slums of Glog and all of the different categories and conversations going on. It was way too much for me. I muted like 99% of that right off the bat. But there was like the secret, I think it was the secret jackalope at the time. It's like their kind of secret Santa thing for holiday, like, I have a request for this, write me a short blog post. And I thought that's such a fun idea. That's when I started my blog, was to facilitate that. And so after a little while, I had been kind of tinkering with Into the Odd stuff myself. And then, yeah, I was very excited for Electric Bastion Land. I was very quick to grab that. Loved all the advice in there. And then when that jam came around, I was like, I think I could do something for this. I had already put Any Planet is Earth out from a different trajectory, but my heart was there for the Into the Odd bigger picture. So the one thing that I love, Gary, is sword and sorcery. And I think, if I want to be pretentious about it, I think that's the true expression of like old school adventure game. Because I think that's like the OSR often talks about like ruins and apocalypses and, dark bargains and things that are gritty and gross. They don't have to be, but I think that comes through anytime somebody tries to say like, what is the aesthetic we're going for? It's not talking about like Dragonlance or Arthurian legend. It's talking about Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser and Jack Vance and his idiot heroes just getting killed left and right, doing stupid things because they think they're better than they actually are. And I looked around and I'm like, I don't think anybody's done like a sword and sorcery thing for Into the Odd or Electric Bastion Land. Why don't I do that? Because I have like a love letter for the picaresque adventurer where you're not really rooting for him, but you also want to see what he does next. That's very much that vein. And I thought, again, to the earlier point, like, you don't need a lot to differentiate something in a significant way. And I thought, what is the thing that Into the Odd does not capture that is, I think, very iconic in sword and sorcery? And it's that like chaotic, corrupting magic. And not just magic, but like anything sticking out of the ground can turn you into a darker version of yourself. Especially when you get into like weird technology and old civilizations and just stuff no one understands, or like you get into that vein of, bargains for power. And I know like Dungeon Crawl Classics is very famous for all their corruption stuff, but again, Dungeon Crawl Classics is very inspiring, but absolutely nothing I'll ever run or play because it's just way too much going on. And I had gotten as a gift, I think the year before, was the second edition, also monolithic tome of Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea. Mm-hmm. And what cracked me up, like my son will pull that off the shelf. I think he was like 4 or 5 at the time, and he'd just like be amazed by all the pictures in there, some of which he certainly should not have been looking at, but that's like one in 100 he's going to find that. But he loved it, and he was just like, these pictures tell such a cool story. And again, that's a huge crunchy book, but the stuff in there is so inspiring. It's like, it is a love letter to that sword and sorcery milieu. So I was like, how can I basically just take that and turn it into what I want it to be? Because I'm already running this. I just haven't like put it to paper, right? So I had various ideas for, how would corruption work? How would that tie into like the simple scores of attributes you have for Into the Odd? And I had worked with Yohai at that point, and he wanted to be an editor for it. And I was like, great. I know you guys talked about that when you got together with him. And we kind of tailored that and made it simple, but still like extraordinarily impactful. Being like, even if you save against corruption, your corruption score still goes up 1. Like, you've been touched no matter how hard you wanted to not be touched. And that's going to hurt you later on. So I've run Weird North many times, And I mean, people often have the conversation of like, can you have a rules light game that sustains a long campaign? Yes, absolutely. I have proven it many times in my own experience. I don't think Weird North qualifies because I have never run that long enough where anyone has not just like burned out like a dying star at some point. You know, I mean, they all dig too deep, which is exactly what I wanted to happen, right? You know, like most of that corrupting stuff is really good for you until all of a sudden it is absolutely not good for you. And you're, you know, things go sideways hard, which I think captures especially a lot of like Jack Vance's stories, a lot of, you know, the original Conan of Samaria. I was surprised pleasantly, Gary, how well I think I actually did nail the vibe I was going for, just with this like random table and a few things on the side. So I was very happy with that. And it was so cool with that jam too, to just see all the different directions that people were going with the original chassis of Into the Odd and the modifications that came from Electric Bastionland. And I'm pleased too, as Yochai had said, like making that Creative Commons allowed Cairn to dip its toe into the original rule idea without having to do a lot of licensing. And I know Chris was cool with that. It wasn't like we were trying to pull a fast one. And that's been so fun to be a part of that group. And I'm running, I think I'm coming into like month 17 or 18 of a local Cairn campaign that I've been running in Dolmenwood, Gavin Norman's setting, with friends from church. And that's probably been the peak role-playing experience I've had in all these years. Just absolutely fantastic. And I mean, it's kind of ostensibly Cairn. I tend to hand wave almost everything, but we say we run that, and it certainly is drawn from the inspiration of the game.
If we take a step back into like the creation of Weird North, you used a lot of Creative Commons images and that kind
all
of
public domain.
Yeah, public domain. And just like maybe for those that are like thinking about, hey, I'd love to make a game, maybe take us through those steps of like, where did you find it? Like, how did you approach it?
Yeah, so there were a few places I looked. One, I want to say it's like Image Splash. Don't quote me on that. It's something like that. I mean, there are many very easily gotten to public domain image repositories. One was Old Book Illustrations. That is so good. And there's a surprising breadth of information and material there. Like you're going to be typing in something, you're like, I don't know, this might be too specific. And bam, there are like 4 things. So, you know, here's some woodblock prints from the 1600s that are exactly what you're looking for. I'm like, well, doggone it, I'm going to take all those. And there are a lot of people, even just in the kind of general community online, that are like, just spend so much time curating public domain art. So I hit some of those people up. Yochai himself has a great, huge Google folder that's just like a bottomless pit at this point. So yeah, Old Book Illustrations. There are a lot of museums that will also curate image libraries that are all public domain. So especially when they get scans of artwork that they're displaying, you know, so it'll be basically like a digital replication of the actual thing, not even a replica of a replica. You can get museum quality prints in digital format, and those are great. So like, I was thinking Odilon Radon, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I used many of his prints throughout Weird North, especially as like backgrounds to the archetypes, because they're dark and sinister and surreal, and yet there's a lot of light used, and just kind of a great tension between average person in a bad context, probably doing bad things, but maybe for a good reason. It's like, it kind of got that feel. Pardon me. So yeah, public domain art was so fun. One of my all-time favorite pieces ever painted is Ilya Repin's the Order from the, I think it's Jarosian Cossacks, probably pronouncing and misremembering that incorrectly, but that's that great. I put that whole spread in as just 2 pages, no context. I just love that piece so much. You know, it's all these amazing, surly, fascinatingly garbed men. You know, kind of, it almost is like a cross section of modernity with a lot of older eras, and they're just laughing. You know, probably just flipping off this Russian oligarch who wants to come in early on and like conquer the Tatars or whatnot, and they won't have any of it. So Ilya Repin is great, and most of his art, I think all of his art, is public domain and has been a wealth for my use.
And you, so if I kind of messed up the order there, but Any Planet is Earth was actually your first game. And can you,
yeah.
And for those that aren't familiar with that one, it's kind of like a hard science fiction, like Traveler-esque, but minimalist in the OSR, FKR style. So how did you approach that one?
So that was my finding, pardon me.
Oh, you go ahead. And I know me and you have talked about it in the past, that Mark Miller's Traveler is a big influence, and it's kind of having a bit of a renaissance right now, that I've seen lots of people trying to dissect it and the importance of it as it fits in with the greater body of work as far as old school games go. And I know part of that, and what Chris maybe unintentionally but intentionally brought with it with his failed careers, was that you can really get the flavor of your character through the character creation process, and that just gives you so much to work with in the OSR environment.
Yeah, I mean, we love random tables, right? That tends to be, even if it's a caricature for some, it goes, hand in glove in terms of how we're, kind of iterating realistic or related or, kind of oracular results to make things happen in this vein of gaming. And I remember, I think it was in 2019, my uncle, who's now passed away, but he was very excited because he found out that I was getting into role-playing games. He's like, oh man, I used to play all the time. And so just on a whim, like he stopped over at my parents' house one day while I was visiting and dropped off this grocery bag that was filled with like his original AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide and tons of modules and like this big binder with just his notes from his games. And there are a lot of references in there to Traveler, which I had at that point still not really heard of. Now, Gary, I love sword and sorcery. I like fantasy. I mean, that's obviously the glut of what most of these games tend to be. But I really have a sweet spot for science fiction and like Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, more actually speculative science fiction that at least attempts to take itself seriously enough to be reasonable. Obviously, there's always going to be some far-flung thing. Less so than giant ridiculous space opera, which is certainly fun. But I read a ton of that sort of science fiction in high school, especially. My brother loved it. He gave me all of his old novels. And so when I found Classic Traveler scribbled on a note in a book from my uncle's AD&D character sheet repository, of all places, I looked it up. And I was aware that Traveler had lots of editions. And to me, as an outsider, I'm like, I mean, I played late editions of things. I'm probably not going to be interested in that. And I looked at it and it's like, yeah, there's really cool stuff here, but it's so bloated. It's just outrageous amount of text and stuff. So I went back to the Classical Traveler and was just bowled over by it. I think that was probably like the last piece in my game evolution. Or at least I've been much more stable in my preferences since finding that. So the thing that got me with what Mark Miller did is, he was kind of saying the same thing, like even back in the late 70s, early 80s, oh man, everybody's doing fantasy, which is funny when we think about that. Like that's just always been the de facto genre. So he did Classic Traveler, and I thought the fusion of two things is what really kind of blew my mind in terms of usefulness and just getting to the heart of it. One is that simple, like reactionary dice throw, 2d6 against a target number, and that's it. That's the only thing. And then also leveraging random tables in a way that are not just silly. They are extremely potent. And by design meant to actually generate the adventure you're going to play. And that's what I thought was interesting, because I mean, even way back when, there were lots of like solid modules for D&D right off the bat and adjacent games where it's like, this is a self-contained thing you can do start to finish. And I mean, Traveler has a lot of modules, but almost all of them are, here's a crew list, here's a sector, here are like some planets, and here's some patrons. And it's just kind of like, there you go. They already, like, the expectation is that you are on the fly populating this stuff and just going from point A to point B to point C, and so you don't want to go to any more points. And it was fascinating to me. Now, I am not so comfortable that I am literally just, dice vomiting out an adventure over 4 hours in an evening. But it just, I think how brazen it was what was so remarkable to me. Like, already he's like, nah, we're not going to do it the way those people do. We're going to totally flip the concept on its head. And I've watched a lot of interviews with Mark. I'd love to actually meet the guy. I know it's just remarkable. And he's always just so simplistic about it. He was never trying to make a point. He's just like, I don't see the bother with all this convoluted stuff. That one, I think there's a Gary Con interview where he only talks about it for a few minutes, but he was talking about Traveler 8, where it was called that because of his 8-year-old grandson that he was playing with. And he was like, this kid understands role-playing games better than most of the adults I've ever played with. And I will say, I have definitely felt that with my own son, who's almost 7, and he gets it. I mean, that kid is a diehard adventurer and like fully appreciates that he has responsibilities within this world. And so backing up back to Classic Traveler, that led me. So the only thing I didn't really like about Traveler was that target throw is like against all this dice modifier, and you still had to take a minute and stop and be like, okay, you've got a +1 over here, and like because of the distance, maybe that's a -2, and then you've got a skill, but it's level 3 skill, so it's and again, it's kind of like that matrix of decisions that crunch down to an end. Like, I mean, it's only ever going to be like a spread of 5, maybe. I just don't care enough to do that. So I was thinking about basically, how did Into the Odd hit OD&D? How would that hit Classic Traveler? Kind of the same mentality. And so I boiled that down basic to like, your target numbers are 7 if you have an advantage of any kind, and 9 if you don't. And that's it. And these are reactionary. You're not willing to do stuff. Already at that point, that was like early 2020. I was of the opinion, Gary, which I think I've further cemented as of this year, really like, if we're playing in a setting and playing the world more than we're playing rules, then if this makes sense in the context, which is not necessarily just me saying it does or it doesn't, maybe I would ask. But if it makes sense, it's just going to happen. I'm more interested in how something happens than if it does or not. I think resolution is actually kind of like one of those weird sacred cows. Like, can't we just decide if it works or not? Like, let's use our brains here. So I made that reactionary only. So even still, a little break from Traveler, but using the same idea kind of backwards. And, Traveler had those life path tables that are just so good. I love that. Some of the most fun character creation ever, because I mean, it is a mini game of its sort, but I'm like, I have caught myself, especially when I was refining the process for Any Planet is Earth. I wouldn't call it play testing because it was just like me in my kitchen late at night rolling dice with myself. But I mean, I just kept doing it. I'm like, what's this guy going to be like? Who's this person? What happened? Like, why do they have 3 careers in like a mercantile ship and then become a Marine? That's so interesting. Why were they betrayed by the NPC that was their friend that I already generated 5 minutes ago? It is so evocative. So I realized just like Classic Traveler has so much to offer in those kernels of precise design. And all of them are to tap your imagination. None of them are to facilitate ease of play. They're to facilitate your imagination. And I think when I read that and kind of figured that out, that's when I thought 5 years ago, this is what I was always looking for. This is what I care about. No one's ever articulated it in a way that I could figure out, but it's like realistic stakes, play the world, be imaginative. And that's around when I had met Norbert Matausch, and Wizard Lizard was another Discord user, and the two of them made that original FKR Discord server. And that had a great heyday and a lot of wealth of information. And I had written Any Planet is Earth with that as a backdrop of the designers and the people who were talking about having never really stopped playing that way and coming to it afresh and being like, oh, what a burden off my back. I finally figured it out what I like. So I wrote that. And it was such a freshman attempt. I mean, I never designed anything. The layout, I was like, oh, Maze Racks looks cool, but I is so cramped. It looks terrible. But it's useful. And I still keep it with me all the time when I run anything science fiction, because I also was like, what random tables do I want that I can't find anywhere else? I'm just going to put all of them into this document. And I then repeated that with Weird North when I realized I want to roll these specific things and I come up with it on the side, but I never put anywhere. So I'm going to put those here. And people even recently have asked, they're like, hey, what random tables do you keep with you? And I reference my own works, and they're like, really? I'm like, well, that's kind of why I wrote them in the first place, was I'm going to have these notes on my side. I might as well put them into something. But yeah, I really got into like more of the diceless play in Any Planet Is Earth, where even though there are reactionary rolls, there's not for combat. It's totally like you have to theater of the mind the whole thing, which I know is freaky for some people. Like if they need resolution anywhere, it's that. And again, I kind of ask the question, do you? I don't think you do. Now, I still do, but I will also, I mean, even in this Cairn campaign that I'm running, there are a lot of things of like, nah, he's dead. I mean, there's no way you survive this. Or, hey, I don't know what to roll. I'm going to, knock the stilt underneath this platform they're on. I'm like, I don't think you have to roll anything there. You just do it. Again, if it makes sense, let it happen. If it doesn't, then let's talk about it. And maybe we should resolve it somehow, outside of our hands. But all that came down to, really kind of refining down to those ideas. And I think it's a misnomer, and I hear it a lot, of FKR stuff, this ultralight gaming. That's not a game. You're just pretend storytelling with each other. In fact, I had a great criticism that was meant as a criticism to me, that is now the header of my blog, because I took it as a badge of honor. And one guy who I had talked with elsewhere, who also has a love of classic Traveler, but like clearly for every different reason that I like it, would always get so upset when I'm like, you just need to just get a few dice, go be in a spaceship. What is your spaceship like? Just, kind of like trust each other, lean into it. Mm-hmm. And he had said like the original poster has a long history of considering randomless group storytelling to be a game, which, was just like mic drop. This guy sucks. And I was like, oh man, that's so good. I'm going to put that on my blog. That's exactly what I'm all about. Because again, I mean, as an aside, we get defensive over the things that we like. And I mean, it's not just in this hobby, it's anything. So if I come in and say, I've been running an 18-month campaign and we haven't rolled dice in 7 months, and look at all these things that we've done, and it's like super realistic, and we have all these integral factions, and people, had a milk run dropping off some cattle from Japan and like another planet over here. And I'm like, well, that's not a game. That's not what I do. That sounds silly, and I don't want to be silly. I guess it's just, it's the way people are. So,
and this might be a good time to actually define, for those that aren't aware of what FKR stands for, just to kind of give some context to it.
Yeah, like all of the far too many acronyms that we juggle. It's Free Kriegsspiel, either Renaissance or Revolution or Recovery, or I don't care.
Revival, who knows?
I frankly couldn't care less, Gary. The point is that I want to say it was Mike Monard. It was an OD&D poster back on like the original OD&D web forum that's still out there that like you can't even get into with a new account because it's so locked down. He had made the point of like, people talk about the OSR, like we're going to bring this back. And he's like, where did you guys go? I never left. Which, is great. I mean, I certainly am not even old enough to make that claim in the slightest, but he was talking not necessarily in, kind of an asinine, condescending way, but saying there is a way that people have just been kind of going for it, never went away. People were iterating in the meantime and doing their cool things, and that became more popular and then became more of the common consensus of how things done. But the like 10-second history lesson is you had Kriegsspiel, which was like this war game simulator for actual military preparation hundreds of years ago in Prussia. they realized there were so many rules to affect terrain and distance and everything. It was basically like war game as we would consider it today, just professionally, that they had free Kriegsspiel. So it's like, let's get an umpire in here who's just experienced, can make a judgment call. We're not going to stop and check all these charts. Like, we trust that we're doing this exercise in good faith together. So if he makes a call, that's good. We're just going to roll with it. And I think another misconception that comes from that, because I said expertise, but I'm talking about like, this guy's a military professional. He has to actually know what he's talking about. We as players just having fun with games, it's like, it ties into the like play the world, not the rules thing, which is often parroted and misunderstood as many times as I've said it. The whole point is, if we have a common touchstone on something, and that could be something much more complex, like, hey, we're going to play this, like eclipse phase transhumanist future that has a lot going on, and you need to know what's going on. But it could also be, you are the Dungeon Crawl Classics dirt farmer. Everything outside of your village is dangerous, and if you get hit by a rock, you're dead. If that's the basic, then like, if you understand it, I understand it. We can rely on like the tropes and the touch points and the flavor that is common to all of us to be the backdrop at which we adjudicate stuff. And I mean, a lot of the free Kriegsspiel revival stuff, there is a strong emphasis on referee authority being like trumping everything else. And I would agree with that in the sense that, like, in my games, I am the final arbiter of what happens. There's no shared narrative. We're not rolling dice to maybe something goes sideways. And I know some people get freaked out with that. It's like every RPG horror story ever is, I had this adversarial GM who just, no matter what I did, was punishing me. And like, that's a person problem. I am totally convinced. Like, you should just not be playing at that table. If somebody is a jerk, don't play with them. Again, that's the good faith element, which is something that in other points of the internet where I've been explaining this to less receptive audiences, they tend to be like, I've never had a good experience. And I'm like, I'm very sorry for that, frankly. I'm not, dismissing it. But the point is not that we have like this iron fist of adjudication. I look at the shared authority as the world that we're playing, as in like, I'm making a ruling based on what we've agreed is the foundation for everything we're doing. So like, as much as you could have a FKR rule set, I think that misses the point, because the point is the world you're playing. The point is that the genre, the tropes you've agreed on, plus trusting the guy or the gal who's just rolling or not rolling, doing whatever they're doing to say, yeah, that's what happens. Those are the two prongs. Trust the referee and each other, and lean into the world. And I think you can really do just about anything you want with that. I've mentioned many times that, expertise is very helpful. Like, if you are really excellent at sincere wilderness survival, like you go backpacking and hunting and trapping, then man, think about the depth you could get in that. But you don't have to be. You could be a person who's just gone camping once, or knows somebody who went camping, or I've looked outside and seen a tree before. I have context. You can kind of scale it as much as you want. So I think there are a lot of misconceptions, mainly because it's hard to trust people. And maybe like I have the benefit of having local friends who I can play with, who we all know we're doing this in good faith, or like I still do a lot of play-by-forum stuff. And that it's like, you almost don't have time to be a jerk most of the time, because the pacing is slow enough that there's always like a deep breath before the next step.
Yeah.
So I get it if it's harder in that vein and you can't rely on people, but I think that's also something you can learn, and something that I have learned even in my circles, and playing with a lot of, like local find a group sort of deals. It has less to do with like, I put my whole life into your hands, Gary. It's like, can you and I agree what a castle looks like? If I jump into lava, do I die, or am I a superhero? Let's start there. And whatever we agree on, just kind of keep riffing. And that's the crux of it.
And then I know, so I'm going to read to you something. I think it was in Weird North, but I could be wrong. It might have been in Any Planet Is Earth. But anyways, it's attributed to you. Play the world. What makes sense is in the context. What does the setting imply? And then the second one is be consistent. Actions have consequences, logic grounds experience and expectation. And the third one, which you were starting to get into, but I want you to flesh it out a little bit more, is ingenuity, not ability. Leveraging tools, wit, and the environment overrides numbers. And I know that's kind of an OSR mentality, FKR mentality. And I know when some people that push back against this kind of style of play are like, well, no, I want to make a perception check. Like my character and their attributes or their scores or their skills, like that's what's important. And when people are put into the position of, no, you're problem solving as the player is actually what's important, it's kind of a different mindset and a shift that some people can't.
I think that is, again, going back to like Mike Monard saying, I never stopped playing this way. And ultimately, it's just like, as you know, as a quick aside, I remember reading something that Mark Miller talked about, because when Classic Traveler started, which in its essence is this style of game, 100%, you know, just like we decide what's going to work, we then just keep on trucking. He got a lot of letters early on of like, hey, Mark, what do you think? Like, what's the damage on this laser pistol, do you think? And he would write back and be like, I don't know. What do you think it is? And he would get more and more of these as the game became more popular, and is like, I guess I should just write down, you know, an answer for people. And then people will stop asking this question, but then they just ask some other questions, you know, like, oh, what, you know, how much, what's the mass ratio of this freighter? So he's like, okay, so I'll write a little thing about it. And eventually it's kind of like you end up accidentally codifying these things that are meant to be more elastic at your table. But I think part of that is like, when that was rewarded, then the next generation of people who then buy a book that says all these things are like, okay, things are this way, it has to be. And I think that just kind of spirals until the popular conception is like, I can do these things that I'm told I'm allowed to do. I cannot do these things. And I think one of the great victories of that return to like the proto-OSR, what has kind of come through it and what it is today is like, yes, you are an app, like your character is an avatar and doing things, but you're also a person at the table. You know, it's not like this perfect simulationist exercise. So I look at that as a nice fusion of like, you are both your character and yourself. You have two modes of impact here. Usually the distinction is so blurred, it doesn't matter. And that's not like an escapist point. That's just something like, if you realize I got these tools, I have this. I also remember like, oh, in a movie once, there's this cool thing that they did. Maybe I'll try that here. You know, it's like, put those two together, do it. So I do think that, and this is something that even though Weird North is a full game and it is based on another full game, those principles that I wrote there are kind of like my unwitting manifesto of, here's how I think my favorite games are played. If these player principles and these referee principles are put together and they're just, you know, humming along. So that kind of ingenuity, like, yeah, you are a person with wit. Like, a lateral solution does not come because you have the lateral solution ability. It's because you're a thinking human being with experience that can be leveraged somehow. Combine that with like, all right, so I know enough about this stupid dirt farmer that I'm playing. He's got a pot of glue and a crowbar and a lantern. Like, how can I leverage those things against, you know, we're in an abandoned quarry. So I know there's like a lot of scaffolding. Probably it's pretty weak. Maybe it's really dry and very flammable. Could I break my lantern over here and like set this thing on fire? These are the things where it's the player and the character, they're fused, they're one thing. And I will tell you, Gary, as much pushback as I've seen of that concept of like, no, you know, like I am the character sheet. I like this Cairn game I've come back to that has been such a highlight. I've got people who are very tenured role players and they've played everything under the sun. I've got people who are coming primarily out of like very mainstream 5th edition Fantasy Flight stuff, and that's all they play for the most part. And then I've got people who have never played a role-playing game in their life. And all of them are on the same footing because they're all bringing, they realize that I am being sincere when I say, if you interact with the world, I will show you what happens. So whether it's coming from more of a like mechanical context or coming from a I saw a cool movie once context, or coming from just like, I don't really even know what a sorcerer who I am would do here, but I'm just going to say something, and they know I'm going to give them a sincere reactive response that is like tied to the fiction we're all sharing. So it almost runs itself. There are times when I run that game and I don't even say anything for an hour because they're just so invested in deliberating over what's going to happen next and thinking and like, okay, we've seen this happen before. What's going to happen next? It's a beautiful thing. I love it. And again, I'll plug like my 6-year-old gets it. So can any adult. There's a wholesome, sincere exploration of imagination that takes place in these games, and that's what I want to capitalize on.
And that goes back to like when you're talking about, you know, your children, and it's that whole like, okay, we're going to play cops and robbers, but bang bang, I shot you, and then the argument of, no, you didn't, I was behind this
right
thing type of thing. But when it's a trust and you go, yeah, you got me, that's when that's when the game actually works, is when there's trust at the table of
or you know, like, hey, here's what the street looks like. You know, it's not just like we're in a vacuum firing guns at each other. It's like, oh, there's a dumpster over here, and it's like, well, I dove behind the dumpster. Like all of a sudden that's a new variable that actually makes sense because you've established that that's what you expect. So yeah.
And here's one question I have, and I don't know if you've seen it solved, but or like if there's an easy answer to it. There probably is an easy answer to it. But so a lot of my audience is game designers, and so you want to design in the FKR world. And so the common kind of trope is that Harry Potter. So we have a Harry Potter book, and let's just play. We have 2d6 and we just roll. And that's, in essence, you really can play in the Harry Potter world. Everybody has a common understanding of it, and we understand bits and pieces of it, and there's a mutual trust, and that can be done. But as a game designer, so how does that fit in as far as you have to convey the world to the players, the GM, and that kind of thing? And so if you have one page of rules, how much world building can you get away with before it becomes, it's not a sandbox anymore? It's like, well, here's the canon, and where do you draw that line?
So I think it's never going to be the full canon, because I agree with you. I think that kind of short circuits the end result, that the point of having to say like, no, here's how the only way it can be. And it is more of the world than the rules. One example I'll give though quickly is the other game that I've released. It's not published anywhere because I don't want Disney to nuke me from orbit, but it's Galaxy Far Away, which is my like Star Wars treatment. And that is the most bare bones of anything I've done. And that I'm like, how do I convey how this works? And so it's like, you're going to create your character. You decide whatever you are. You know, I don't care if you've never seen Star Wars, you've only heard of it, or you know all of it. Like, pick a person. You're that person. You could be a droid if you wanted to. Great. If you're not a droid, maybe you're force sensitive. Roll a die to find out. And then it's like you have a starting loadout of very basic stuff, but it's all Star Wars stuff. It's all, kind of like set piece props that you would imagine in that universe. And I include, for the sake of somebody wanting to run this themselves, a few random tables of like, what's a job that these people would have? And, put the Star Wars flavor in there. Like, oh, you have a run-in with a cartel. Okay, roll in the cartel. And it's like the actual syndicates from the films, or, a bad guy that's referenced in one of the comics. Stuff that cannot be not Star Wars. It is Star Wars. But still letting that kind of be emergent. So it's like, I'm passing the baton of like, here's just enough you need to know. I ran this with a group of people, and one of them, sincerely, despite my belief, it was just in pop culture vacuum here, had never seen anything from Star Wars. I'm like, I just don't know how that ever happened. Fair enough. But it's like, but I know what it is. I'm like, yeah, and that guy's just as invested as the other players who, the one who's like obnoxiously repeating this expanded universe novel that he wrote that was terrible and was rejected as fan fiction because it was so bad. But, it's like, you don't need much. I think you really just need a simple anchor, and everyone can hold on, and you go from there. It's not difficult, and it's not aimless, stupid, no consequences cops and robbers. we are setting the tone. It's a 5-minute conversation. Here's what this looks like. Here's how you play. Here's how dangerous the world is. If people are interesting, they're not just meat bags to be shot down with a blaster. If you do that over time, you're going to get arrested, because that's just common sense. So fuse that common sense with what we know, what we're doing, and here's maybe a simple way to resolve issues if we get into them, and then go for it.
Well, and that probably brings us to what's the next steps in your own game design evolution, and what are you looking forward to in the future?
Something I really think mechanically is interesting are like dice pools. I haven't done much with those, and I just think it's fun. I mean, they're, as much as I'm the a poster boy unwittingly of like this do whatever you want or do nothing approach, I do like mechanics. I do like rules. I really love procedures. I just usually those are backported to just my business, and I'm not making us waste time at the table to have it happen. I think dice pools are really cool. I've seen like Messerspiel is a great one that Oz did. That's kind of like Blades in the Dark reduced to just a handful of dice, which is great because Blades in the Dark is so cool, but that is one of the crunchiest, most overwrought books I've ever seen. And I don't understand how it ever bills itself as a breezy role-playing experience. Fair enough. I think like I've acknowledged in many places where there are too many games and not enough things to do with games generally. It's easier and safer, and I speak from my own experience, to like, hey, I like Into the Odd, let's make it barely different and call it something else. And now I've got my own game. I'm a designer. I'm not being cynical, but it's like it's our natural first stop, because that tends to be easier than like, how do I actually make an interesting locale where people are real and doing things together? So like I have been enjoying my blog riffing back on like, here are things I'm doing with Weird North and Any Planet is Earth. I want to get a second edition of that sometime. The computer that had all my design software died, and I was a dummy and didn't back anything up. So it's like, maybe that'll never happen. Maybe somebody will step in and help. I had one person who's already said, hey, I might be able to help you with that, which is great. So like, I'd like to polish these a little bit, but also like to just do stuff for them. Like there's a dearth of great science fiction adventures. Mothership is sweet. Yochai mentioned in his episode, like, doesn't like the system at all, but it's like the coolest modules ever. I would agree. But there are also only so many of those. And I'd also like to push, I'm not necessarily writing like horror adventures in space. I would like to do something maybe even more mundane, even though it doesn't sound exciting. But like, to me, just being like Space Trucker is a cool idea. Just going places and meeting people, and like I said earlier, dropping off cattle because people still need beef in space. So I like to do stuff like that. I was thinking the other day of going back and taking some of the big dungeons from World of Warcraft that I played way back when, that were just so immersive and cool because nobody had ever done it before, and have an outrageous amount of lore and missions and quests that I could really think actually would work better on a tabletop than it would as a computer game. I'd love to try and adapt that, and I might do that, but I got a full-time job and kids and going seminary, and I'm an elder, and I was on a school board. Like I don't have a lot of free time.
Yeah.
I mostly am just pittering out stuff when it makes sense to me. So I've never had grand plans for me as like a big name. And like I said, I don't have any social media. I couldn't care less if nothing I ever do gets promoted, but I like to do it. And I am happy that people are interested in it, and that it's made impacts, and that it's developed good conversations. So I'm never going to ghost out on anybody, but it isn't this, it's not like a pseudo career for me. And I'm very content with that. I respect everybody who pumps out amazing stuff, but you're probably like not going to see me on Kickstarter, and that's okay with me.
Cool. And so people can find you on Classless Kobolds on itch and Drive Through RPG. And your blog is d66kobolds.blogspot.com. And we'll put all those links in the description of the video. But I just want to say, thanks for sharing your own design journey, your insights on FKR in particular, and your games that you've kind of developed around those concepts. And I look forward to seeing what comes out in the future.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Gary. It's a great conversation.